Hello and welcome to this session on the Lexical-Functional Grammar course. We're going to do Anaphora and inside-out functional uncertainty today. Today we're doing it without an audience because, so I'm sitting in front of an empty room, because I'm going to be missing next week's lecture. We'll hop right in, we'll dive right in and start. The background, just so you know, the material in these slides is based on Dalrymple 2001, chapter 11, and I've given you the page numbers there. Pay attention to the definitions on pages 281 and 283. They're going to be important, and also relevant are pages, if you want to read it, 174 to 179 in Peter Sells's book. So I'm going to start out by telling you all about classic binding theory. I haven't really done that in the rest of the course. I've just introduced LFG to you. But in this case, I think it's more useful to actually do that. So classic binding theory was formulated as part of government and binding in general, and the reference for that is Chomsky, 1981. And the generalizations with respect to pronouns or reflexives, so binding theory is a bigger thing, but with pronouns and reflexives, it revolved around understanding how anaphora resolution works. And some of the core examples are given here. So if you look at this, there is a reflexive called an anaphora in Chomsky's original. Tabby McTatt licked himself. And what you see here, I've got little letters over here. Yeah, so you can see that. So this is supposed to be an I, and this is an I, and this indicates co-reference. I think I'll draw on the board after all. So this indicates co-reference. This indicates that this is talking to that, or is referring to that. Okay, so I and I. And here himself refers to Tabby McTatt, and here him refers to not to Tabby McTatt. That is supposed to be a K if you can see it, and this is supposed to be an I. So this him has to be somebody other than Tabby McTatt. It can't be this one. It has to be somebody outside of the clause, somebody else entirely. Okay, and then the same with this example, Tabby McTatt. If you don't know who Tabby McTatt is, go read Julia Donaldson's books. So anyway, so in this case, Tabby McTatt, this is a K, this is a J. They cannot co-refer. The idea is that these are referring expressions and they need to be free. It might be easier if we had an example like John sees John. I think it's a bit easier to understand, where you can think of it as this individual John is probably different than this individual John. You don't want John to be referring to the same thing. Okay, so I'll say that again. So just because somebody has the same name doesn't mean they're the same individual. The idea is that this John doesn't have to be the same as just this John. You want them to be free. You don't want them to be bound to each other. I won't be talking very much more about these referring expressions. We'll be concentrating on the reflexives and the pronouns mainly. Okay. What else do we need to know? Binding theory looked at syntactic constraints on anaphora resolution. There's many more. There's pragmatic and contextual constraints. We're going to leave those aside and we're going to concentrate on the syntax of things. Okay. And there's also constraints in terms of gender, number, and agreement, and I'm going to assume those are operational. We'll be referring to those a little bit, but I'm not going to make a big deal about them. Okay, so let's move on. So here's classic binding theory. There are three principles, A, B, and C. I'll do it on the board. So principle A is an anaphora must be bound in its governing category. Principle B, a pronoun must be free in its governing category. And principle C, an R expression must be free everywhere. Okay, so we're going to be looking at this over and over again. This is the way Chomsky had stated it. And there is a long discussion, well, not a long discussion, but it's not easy figuring out what the governing category is in the classic binding theory and beyond. This notion of C command is extremely important. I won't go through this with you. I just want you to know this. Okay? It's in terms of a tree approach, the C command, where if you had a tree, you could decide which node C commanded which other node. LFG doesn't do this. What I will do is show you the LFG approach instead. We'll just go through that and learn about that. And the basic approach to anaphora resolution in LFG assumes that you're going to do F structure. F structure is the relevant level of figuring out what binding constraints are. The basic approach, and this is the most landmark publication on this topic, is Mary Dalrymple's dissertation, which was published in 1993. And there's been discussions and successive improvements since then, but the state of the art is as in Dalrymple and Bresnan in 2001. So that's what you should look up if you're just doing basic stuff. But of course, there's much more. Okay, and I've already said this. Binding theory takes the tree-based approach, and LFG identifies F structure as the most general approach. What I've done here is I've given you the principles A, B, and C. Like I said, I won't be talking about this very much, but I've given it to you here. And the examples, the core examples. And I've given you the LFG formulation. So for principle A, LFG says reflexives have to be bound in the minimal nucleus, and we'll talk about what that is in a minute. Pronouns have to be free in their co-argument domain. You can see it's fairly similar in some sense. So principle A said a reflexive must be bound in its governing category. So you're trying to figure out what binds a reflexive. Principle B says where shouldn't it be bound? So it's the negative one. Where is it free? And that's what LFG is also trying to figure out. Once we're talking about the minimal nucleus, and once we're talking about the co-argument domain. So let's see what that is about. Okay, so here's just the LFG. Here's the definitions. Minimal complete nucleus is a minimal F structure with a subject function. So for example, something like this, where we have a pred, and it has something in it, and there's a subject and an object. This would be a minimal F structure with a subject function, okay? And if we have something on top of that, if we have a pred with another pred in it, for example, a comp, we have another pred here. This is still the minimal F structure. Okay, this would be the minimal F structure. So wherever you are, you're looking for an F structure, the minimal F structure. This outer one is not the minimal F structure. That one has another pred and a subject contained within it. Okay? So you're looking for a minimal F structure with a subject function. That would be this one. That'll be relevant for reflexives. For pronouns, and we're talking about English here all the time. I'll have a point about that at the end. We're going to talk about the co-argument domain. That is the minimal domain defined by a pred and the grammatical functions it governs. Basically, this one is fairly easy. If you have some pred and it has some arguments, subject, object, oblique. Okay, these are all co-arguments. They're all at the same level. Okay, so that's what's going to be relevant for pronouns, and I'm going to give you examples over and over again. So these two are that. Now let's look at some examples. The example I started out with, Tebby McTat likes him. Remember, this will come over and over again. This time you don't have to look at it, it's just on the slides. Pronouns have to be free in their co-argument domain. So let's look at this. Tabby McTat licked him. We have a pred lick. It has a subject and an object. And I've given you some information here. I've just given you very basic subject information. I haven't given you number, gender, etc. Just Tabby McTat. And an object, which is our pronoun. This basically corresponds to him. And the way pronouns look in LFG is you have a pred. And the traditional way of doing it is to call it a pro there. Actually, should be a little pro anyway. You give it a pron type. And a singular, number singular, person 3, gender masculine, etc. Okay. So this is our pronoun. The pronoun has to be free in its co-argument domain. What's its co-argument? Subject, this one here, right? So it cannot refer to Tabby McTat. So him cannot be this cat. So it must refer to some other entity. So it's somebody else. Okay, so he licked some other creature. Now let's see how that works with reflexives. Same F structure. Main difference is this. Pron type is now reflexive. So this corresponds to the himself. Himself. That's this. Otherwise, the F structure is exactly the same. What does it say? Reflexives have to be bound in the minimal nucleus they occur in. So this is the reflexive. The minimal F structure is the entire F structure, actually. Because what was the minimal nucleus? The minimal nucleus, minimal complete nucleus, I've given you the definition here, is a minimal F structure with a subject function. So we go here, we go find an F structure, this one, and check if it has a subject. Yes. So the minimal nucleus is actually this whole thing, this whole F structure. And it has to be bound by something. The reflexive has to be bound by something in this whole F structure. Well, the only thing that's there is this. So in this case, himself refers to Tabby McTat. That's the only thing that's there. Okay? And what one also says is that the subject is the antecedent of the reflexive. So in this case, himself refers to Tabby McTat. In the previous case, where we had him could not refer to Tabby McTat, but to somebody else. And it falls out from these principles that we have here. Now let's look at some more complex examples. Jane hopes that Max will hire her versus Jane hopes that Max will hire herself. In this case, herself cannot refer to Jane. That's why I've got the star here. Up there, Jane hopes that Max will hire her. That works. Jane liked the story about her. That works. Jane liked the story about herself. That works apparently as well. Jane wrapped the blanket around herself works. Jane wrapped the blanket around her works as well. These two are the same type of example. It's just two different sentences, but it's the same structure. Okay, so now let's figure out there's one contrast here. So in this case, herself cannot refer to Jane. In that case, her can refer to Jane. And in the other two cases, you can get references to Jane either way. Okay, so let's see how that works out. We'll start with the first one. Jane hopes that Max will hire her. I've done you an F structure here. Pred hope, up there. Okay, so up here. Subject complement. The subject is Jane. The comp has hire in it, which has a subject and an object. Max is the subject, and this is the her. In this time, it's feminine gender. Okay, so the pronoun, which is this, the comp's object, has to be free in its co-argument domain. What's its co-argument domain? It's this. Okay, so her cannot refer to Max. That's good because Max is masculine anyway. But if we had something else here, say like Louise, Jane hopes that Louise will hire her, it couldn't refer to Louise either. Okay, it has to be free in its co-argument domain. What it can do, it can refer to Jane. Yeah? It just has to be free here, but it can refer to anything else outside of this. It can refer to Jane or to some other person. Kim or Sandy or anybody else like that. Okay, so here, her can refer to Jane, but not to Max or anybody else who's the subject here. Now let's look at the next one. Jane hopes that Max will hire herself. Again, same F structure except for this bit. So this is our reflexive, herself. Reflexives have to be bound in the minimal nucleus they occur in. What's the minimal nucleus? It's the one, it's an F structure, so let's look out from here. This is our nearest F structure. It's an F structure which contains a subject. Does this contain a subject? Yes, it does. So the minimal nucleus is this. Okay. They have to be bound in the minimal nucleus that they occur in. So this herself can only, in fact, be bound by this subject in principle. But now we have a problem. This is feminine, this is masculine. So that doesn't work. There is a clash in terms of agreement features. Okay? So it can't refer to Max because of agreement features. And it can't refer to Jane. Herself can't refer to Jane because Jane is outside of this minimal nucleus. It can't refer to that. So we have nobody who this can refer to. So this sentence is actually completely ungrammatical because herself can't refer to Max or anything else. Well, it can't refer to Max and it can't refer to Jane. So there's no antecedent for this reflexive, and this sentence doesn't work at all in English. Okay, moving right along. The different example, this is an example with a prepositional phrase. Jane liked the story about her. Again, I'm starting with a pronoun. Here's still something left. Okay, so Jane liked the story about her. Let's do the F structure. I've given it to you. Like is a two-place argument. It has a subject, Jane, and an object, story. About her is an adjunct, modifying story. It's a story about her. In the adjunct there's a pred, about, which takes an object. It's a semantic preposition. Remember we had those in a different lecture. And about takes the object. So again, this is our pronoun, her. And pronouns have to be free in their co-argument domain. What is that? Well, it's this. There is no co-argument. So it has to be free in this, that's okay. So it can refer to anything else. It can refer to Jane, that's outside of the co-argument domain, or something else, Sandy or Kim or Louise or anybody like that. Okay? So Jane liked the story about her works, and Jane can be an antecedent. Now let's try the reflexive. Same F structure, except that this is a reflexive pronoun. Reflexives have to be bound in the minimal nucleus they occur in. What's the minimal nucleus? An F structure which contains a subject. We look up. Does this F structure contain a subject? No. So we need to go to the next one. Does this one contain a subject? No. Does this one contain a subject? Yes. So this is the minimal nucleus in which it needs to be bound. And that means that this is the only other thing in here. It needs to be bound by Jane. Well, actually, it could also be bound by this object in principle. These are both possible. But since it's herself, we'll take Jane, because story is not feminine. Okay, so Jane is a possible antecedent for the reflexive, and the reflexive is bound, and the sentence is good. Okay, so now recall that what I just said, this is a semantic preposition. It takes an object. We went through this in a different lecture. And recall also that we had a difference between semantic and non-semantic prepositions. Okay? And this distinction actually has a tangible effect with respect to anaphora resolution. So you can see it empirically. There's some examples here. These are the semantic prepositions. These are the ones we just saw. This is the one we just looked at. Here's another example. Wrap the blanket around her. Wrap the blanket around herself. Works exactly the same. And here's an example with a non-semantic preposition. And what you see here, it doesn't work like this. The herself, the reflexive one, works the same way. Herself can refer to Jane. But this one doesn't. Okay, so here the her can't refer to Jane. The her has to be somebody else entirely. So let's see how that works out from our F structures. So we already saw the ones with the adjunct. Now let's see what it works out with a non-semantic preposition. Here's the F structure for send the book to her. Jane sent the book to her. Send is a three-place argument. In this case, it has a subject, an object, and an oblique. Subject Jane, object book, and oblique is her. Yeah. And I've got a P-type no-sem and a P-case 2. So the pronoun has to be free in its co-argument domain. These are its co-arguments. So it can't refer to either book or Jane. Okay. And what's the difference? The difference is that the other time we had an object, and the object contained, that was the pred story, and that contained an adjunct which had the pronoun in it. Okay. And the pronoun was an object in this adjunct. So that's the difference that's going on here. Okay. Before it could refer to Jane because it was not in its co-argument domain. Now it can't refer to Jane because it is in its co-argument domain. So when you have a semantic preposition, what did we have? We had around with an object. Okay. When you have a semantic preposition, you get this extra layer of embedding. And then the pronoun can refer out. In this case, it can't because there's no extra layer of embedding. So the co-argument domain is different. You can switch back to the other slides and compare them rather than the scribbling here. With the reflexives, it is the same, it's a different reason why it can refer, but it's the same effect. Reflexives have to be bound in this minimal nucleus. What's the minimal nucleus? Well, here we are. We go look at an F structure, see if it has a subject. Yes, it does. Okay, so this is the F structure that we need to find our antecedent in. This is a possible antecedent. This is a possible antecedent. This is feminine. Jane is feminine. So we'll pick this as our antecedent. Okay, so that works out quite nicely. And it's exactly the same effect as the other one where we had the object and an adjunct inside that. So this was story, pred story, and then there was an adjunct in here with pred about, with the object. And then there's the object here, and this was our pronoun. Okay, and it has the same effect as before, as this one, because if you look at what the minimal finite nucleus is, in the other example it looked out this way, no, looked out this way, and then it went out all the way to end up at the same level as here. And then it looked for Jane or for book or story, and it ended up with Jane. So in both of these examples, this one and the semantic preposition, you end up with the same antecedent with Jane, but for different reasons. Here you're immediately going out to this F structure and saying, okay, this is the F structure that's the minimal complete nucleus. It has a subject. And then you can try to find one of these as an antecedent. Over here you had to look further out for the F structure with the minimal complete nucleus until you found this one. It's the only one which had the subject. And then you could do the antecedent. Again, look at the slides, the one with the semantic preposition with like the story about herself versus this one, and try to figure out exactly, or try to reconstruct what I've just shown you. Okay, here's a little bit of further complexity. I haven't talked about this type of thing before, but there's this contrast that's talked about in the literature. And it works out nicely within the system that we've just looked at. So I've given you this contrast. So we've had Jane liked the story about herself, but something happens when you put in a possessor, Louise. Jane liked Louise's story about her, that's good. Her can be Jane. Jane liked Louise's story about herself. That cannot be Jane. It can actually only be Louise. Jane liked Louise's story about herself. These two match. And these two can't match. Jane can't be herself. It can't be, herself cannot refer to Jane here. Okay. So the way this can be explained, we need some assumptions. We need to assume a grammatical function pos. And we need to assume that it is like a subject in certain ways. Not in all ways, but in certain ways. And there's quite a bit of literature in LFG about the role of pos, particularly with respect to Hungarian. So you can read up on that if that interests you. But for right now, for these purposes, we'll assume that pos functions like a subject. And the reason that's important is because we need it to determine the minimal complete nucleus. Okay? So now let's look at examples to see how that actually works out. Same procedure as before. Here's the example. Jane liked Louise's story about her. Like subject-object, subject Jane, object story, pos Louise. This is the new bit. Okay, this is the new bit. There's a possessor. It's Louise's story. Yeah. And then this we've seen before. There's an adjunct. It's modifying story. About takes an object. It's a semantic preposition, and here's our object. This is our pronoun. Okay. So let's see how this works out. We're with pronouns. Pronouns have to be free in their co-argument domain. Here's the pronoun. Its co-argument domain is this. There's nothing here. So it can look outside. It can actually refer to Lise if it wants to. That's possible. And it can refer to Jane. Okay, because they're both outside the co-argument domain. Now let's look at the reflexive. Again, same F structure. Oh, there's a mistake here. I didn't change this. This needs to be reflexive. Okay, so otherwise same F structure. Reflexives have to be bound in the minimal complete nucleus they occur in. What's the minimal complete nucleus? Well, let's check. We're here. Is there a subject in this F structure? No. Is there a subject in this F structure? Well, there isn't a subject, but there's a pos. And for our purposes, we've said pos is like subject for anaphora resolution, so this counts. So the minimal complete nucleus is this thing. And it has to be bound in here. So object has to refer to Louise. Okay, it cannot refer to Jane. That doesn't work. It has to be bound within this nucleus. So it cannot refer to Jane. It can only refer to Louise in this case. And if there was something else in here like Max, who would be masculine gender, so this is feminine, this is masculine. If there were somebody in there like Max, then we would have an antecedent failure. We would have a reference failure because it can only refer to something that's feminine. Okay, so that works out quite nicely as well. Okay, so now we've seen several examples. You can go through, you should work through the slides. You should look at the book, chapter 11. What I want to do now, as sort of the last part of this lecture, is to go through the formal part. We've seen how anaphora resolution works with F structure generalization. It works quite well. But now, and we've seen how to describe it. You do this, you do that. But how do we actually do the formal realization? So in the past, we've always looked at the trees. We've given a grammar. We've said, we've annotated the trees with something like ups object equals down. So in the past, we've understood how to write these kinds of functional annotations on trees to get our generalizations. And what I want to do with you a little bit here, very, very briefly, it's actually quite complex to get these anaphora resolution things done in LFG, but I want to give you an idea of how it's done. So the idea is that the way we've seen it happen so far is that when I've gone through the examples with you, I've said, okay, we are here. What does the F structure around me look like? Yeah. Where's my antecedent? But generally the way I've described it is that you start out with a pronoun. The pronoun says, what F structure am I in? Do I have co-arguments? What is my minimal nucleus? And then it tries to find its antecedent. Okay, so that's what I've done so far. That's how I've always described it. So you begin within a given F structure and figure out the path. You figure out a path to your antecedent. And that should remind you of something. It should remind you of something that we did recently in terms of long distance dependencies. Okay, if you remember, we did those beans I like, beans I think that Chris likes, beans I want Mary to think that Chris likes, etc. What we did there is we talked about a topic path or a dependency path. And it looks something like this. We said the topic can be either comps or ex-comps. 0 or infinitely many, and it could be an object or object theta. This is wrong here. This part is wrong. Okay, and we talked about that in terms of functional uncertainty. And in fact, it's called outside-in functional uncertainty. And I'll show you why that is in a minute. Well, we know why that is. We always started outside from the F structure and looked in and found our path in. For anaphora resolution, in contrast, we use inside-out functional uncertainty. Okay, and I'll show you what that means again. So, but I'll show it to you here again, and then I'll have some more slides. So when we start out here, and this is our pronoun, and then we go out, this is called inside out. In contrast, if we have a dependency path where we say this is my topic and I need to figure out where this is, we were going outside in. Okay, it's a fairly easy concept once you've understood it, but people tend to take a little bit of time to understand what's exactly going on. Okay, and I'll try to explain it in the next slides. Okay, so here I've given you a C structure, the kind of C structure that we've used in the course. Chris, we think that David likes. And I've given you an F structure that corresponds to this. Pred think, subject comp, subject is pro, we. So this refers to we. And the comp has pred like subject object, and we don't know what the object is, right? So what do? We do know Chris is up here. We've got it as a topic, but we don't know what else there is. So that's what we need there. So we've had this type of dependency path, right? A long distance dependency path of the type that we just saw. And now what happens? We say this thing here, we know it's either in a comp or an X-comp, and it's either an object. GF up there stands for some kind of grammatical function. So we know it's some kind of grammatical function, but we don't know which kind. Okay, some kind of grammatical function, we don't know which kind. So let's go look for it. So let's start out here. We're here, topic is here. So we're going to start out here. And we're going to say, okay, now either comp or X-comp or nothing. Well, there's nothing else here but a subject, so that's not going to work. So let's look inside the comp. And oh, we can find an object here. Okay. So in fact, what we're doing is we're going from the outside in. We're saying, let's start this up arrow here. This up arrow here refers to this F structure. It says whatever this F structure is in, this F structure, let me see if I can find a path through it, through various comps or X-comps, to find an object or object theta. Okay, so you're saying start out here, see if I can find a comp or an object. If I can, try to see if there's an object missing. If not, keep going. Okay, so then we keep going and we find an object, and there's no object here. So then we can identify those two. Okay, so we did all that with long distance dependencies. The point is we're going from the outside, looking for a path inside. So that was what we did with long distance dependencies. Now let's look at anaphora. So here's the example that we had before, except now with David, wrapped the blanket around himself. Here's the F structure for it. Wrap subject object, David blanket, adjunct around himself. Okay. Around has an object, it's a semantic preposition, and here's the object. So what are we going to do? We're going to say, well, this little pronoun, reflexive, this reflexive needs to figure out what its antecedent is, somewhere up here in the tree, or rather somewhere up here in the F structure. And in this case, we're going to want it to end up being with David, so let's see how that works. Here is a functional uncertainty equation. This is an inside-out functional uncertainty equation. Okay, you remember with the long distance one, we had something like ups. The path that we had was ups comp or x comp. And then we had either an object or an object theta is equal to down. And we have the down arrow over here and the up arrow over here. What this thing means is it says take some grammatical functions, any number, any kind. I should start out the other way. I should start it the other way. What this says is figure out the grammatical function of your pronoun. Okay, figure out the grammatical function of your pronoun. Find an F structure for that. Starting from that F structure, go out and look for grammatical functions until you find the minimal F structure, which is contained in this pronoun. Okay, I'll show it to you visually what's happening here. So here's my pronoun, my reflexive. Okay, my pro. It says, okay, what's my F structure? What's my grammatical function? Oh, an object. Okay, I'm an object. And now I need to find an F structure. In this case, I need to find the minimal complete F structure with a minimal complete nucleus with a subject. So let me go and find it. And what this way of writing it does has exactly this effect that you start out here and you go out. There's nothing here. You go here. Go to this F structure with the adjunct, no subject here. So then you keep searching. Okay, over here, and there you have a subject here. So you identify that, and you figure out that this is the grammatical function that you're looking for. Okay, it's a bit difficult to explain, but this is essentially what's happening. And I don't need you to understand exactly how this equation works or how you're going to write it yourself. This won't be part of what you need to know. What I need you to understand is that you're doing a search path from the inside of an F structure outside and then identifying an antecedent. That's what I need you to know, okay? Okay, so that's that. So I need you to understand the difference between inside out and outside in functional uncertainty. That's basically what I need you to understand. That from the one hand, you're going from the inside and doing a search path, and the other option is you're going from the outside in. That's all you need to know for this. Okay, this is the last slide. I just want to point out that there's some cross-linguistic variation. We've discussed examples from English so far. It works quite well for English, the system. But not all Anaphora work the same way. Mary Dalrymple's done an in-depth study of Norwegian, along with some co-authors, for example. You get the same kinds of patterns broadly, but interesting differences. You can see her thesis for a detailed discussion, her chapter for some discussion. And in her chapter in the textbook, she gives these 4 things that are determined as being relevant for figuring out antecedents. We've seen the co-argument domain. We've seen the minimal complete nucleus. What's also relevant for other structures, for other languages, for example, Norwegian, is the minimal finite domain. That's the minimal F structure domain with a tense feature. And also a root domain, which is the F structure of the entire utterance. And I won't go into any more patterns here. She gives you a nice table in the textbook, so you can go look that up. And there's more cross-linguistic work that needs to be done with respect to this. So if you feel like this is something you would like to do, there's much to be done there. And that ends today's lecture.